people. But what's really concerning, Madam Speaker, it's not just young people who aren't voting. That 40% who don't vote aren't all made up of, 19 and 25-year-olds. There's a lot of citizens in our province who said, what's the use? Why do I participate? And I'll be honest with you, I've been extremely discouraged, not by the federal result. While I might not have liked it, I can tell you I was really discouraged by the young woman who got elected in Quebec who never campaigned. Because people in my riding, whether I disagree with them, and I do in some cases, they work to get elected. I lost a campaign in '99 and I knocked on doors. And I know what it was like, and I won campaigns since. And I know men and women whose families put their whole 35 days on hold, so they go knock on doors and work hard. But at the end of the day, they might not win. But yet we have someone who never knocked on a door, never showed up in the riding. I think she's going to visit. I read in the paper she's going to go visit because she heard it was a nice place. But that was discouraging. And that tells you the level of I won't say anger, but apathy that's out there, but it tells you the level that's going on out there when it comes to voter participation and we have to find a way as elected members to turn that around. There's nothing better than in a community when you have men and women who stand up and say, I want to represent you, and here's why. And you go out and you pound on doors, and you go out and work as hard as you can to get your vote, and then you try to encourage as many people to go participate, and at the end of the day, you accept the verdict. Sometimes we don't like it. Other times we're really encouraged by it. But it's what we should be doing. And that result in one of those Quebec ridings, I didn't look at it as because of the political party that's being represented. I looked at it from all of us. And I'm like all parties. We're trying to encourage someone to run in a by-election, which is going to happen at some point into the future in Carrot North. But we're out there looking for people because we believe in this process. We believe in what we're doing. We believe that each individual community should have a voice in the House of Assembly. And we look for somebody who's going to have the energy and enthusiasm to go to knock on doors and show the passion that each of our communities has to bring to this House. And they're not all going to win. But in order for a healthy, modernized democracy to be in place, each of us need to have somebody representing our voice as parties in by-elections who are actually out there working, who are actually out there engaging their citizens to find out what the issues that matter to them. Because without it, we get an opportunity where, the minority chooses who the voice is. The minority of voters choose who the voice is. That's not healthy. That's not the direction we should be going. I've said this in my own riding. I'd rather lose with a large turnout of public participation than win with fewer. And this is where I see this third-party advertising bill affecting how we go forward. And I don't want us to turn into, quite frankly, our elections like it's going to happen in the U.S. I fought internally in the last campaign not to do negative ads. I've said that publicly in the press. It's going to be awful hard for me to do that going forward when I see the results. But you know what those things do? They limit participation because people get fed up. And fewer people show up to the polls. But that's good in some people's minds because that means they only have to get a small percentage to get elected. But that's not good for all of us. That's not good for the democracy in this province or in this country. And the Elections Nova Scotia has identified a real challenge and a real problem. And we have different views on how we settle that, but we should recognize it's there, and we're going to try to settle it, and we should do it before we reach law amendments and go in and lay out those things. Because I think collaboratively we can find a solution to this. Where's the middle ground? Elections Nova Scotia, the people that we have all appointed to sit on Elections Nova Scotia, the people that they've engaged outside of that organization, all recognize that as being a problem, and they've sent it back here. They've sent it back. It was not part of the original bill. The minister has said he was going to try to deal with third-party advertising. We encourage him now to call us. I encourage him to read Bill 60. It doesn't mean it has to adopt Bill 60. If he has a better way to deal with it, if he has a more constructive way to deal with it, we'll be more than happy to support that. But we would like that dialogue to start now, one, so that would allow us to not only begin to move forward in modernizing the Elections Act, but it will allow us to deal with what was the only recommendation that wasn't dealt with in the original bill that the Elections Nova Scotia brought forward. Madam Speaker, I've almost said I think I speak for everybody in this House, but I don't want to do that. I saw all the heads pop up. But I think I speak for a vast majority. Our goal here is to modernize the Elections Act, to find a way to encourage more Nova Scotians to participate of all ages. Electronic voting is one that will not just impact young voters, it will affect seniors all across this province. Many of them are tuned in, they're on the web more than most of us are. And it is a positive way to allow them to participate. And it is an opportunity for us to make sure that no organization, no entity, whether it's business, whether it's unions, whether it's outside organizations who have no affiliation to any political party, but may have a real huge desire on a particular cause, that they do not have an avenue to influence elections. That they can participate, their voices can be heard, but they should never determine them. That's not what we're looking for here. What we're looking for here is an opportunity to make sure that this is a level playing field, that all of our voices are heard individually and as communities and as organizations, but not in a way that it influences the outcome of the election. What we want, and I think what all members of this House want, is a healthy, vibrant democracy, one that is encouraging participation from one end of this province to the other, from all ages, making sure to ensure that the people who land in this House after the next election are reflective of their community. And at the end of the day, like I said earlier, I may not always agree, but I respect it. And the voters never get it wrong. Let's make sure that the rules we put in place are fair, are modernized, and are one that is engaging not only us as members, but community and organizations. Madam Speaker, with that, I will close. I will sit down.
Thank you very much. I recognize the honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'm pleased to have an opportunity as well this afternoon to speak to this bill, the Elections Act, and I do understand it's been a good many years since anything has been done to bring it up to date, and we certainly need that. One of the things certainly of concern, Madam Speaker, was quite simply the fact that the minister seemed to be in a hurry to get it through. I think I don't know if he used the words hurry, but he was anxious to get this through and passed. I don't know exactly how we're going to be able to get it through in a hurry if we're going to do and give it the proper time for consultation and involve our youth that are out there. I think that the youth and those kids around voting age, 18, 19, 20, 25, have a lot of questions. I know that you, Madam Speaker, probably lots of members in this House visit their schools, probably talk to their grade 12 classes. I know I have in the past. People come into your offices, you run into them at events, especially during election time, and they're curious as to, whether it's a simple question, well, where do I go vote, or how do I go vote, or how do I get one of those cards? All very important questions. So there is an interest. I do believe that there is an interest there, but sometimes I just don't know how, don't know what to do next. And we haven't really done a great job of answering that, in my opinion, I don't think, Madam Speaker. But the last thing I want to do is hear that we're in a rush to get it through, or in a hurry to get it through, and we just can't do that if we're really going to give this bill the time that it needs. And there are a lot of people that need to be involved, not just the youth and those that we're trying to get into the process, I think, but even those that are voters. We heard a lot of talk about, new ways of voting. Maybe it's electronic voting somehow online, or maybe it's telephone voting. I don't know. I do know in campaigns past from leaderships and things like that, there were voting done by telephone and a number of different ways. So these are not new. I do know, however, though, and I believe it was in the last municipal campaign, there was a pilot done on electronic voting, and I don't believe that there was any increase in the number of vote that came out, strangely enough. It was exactly the same, or pretty darn close to exactly the same, but it was not the significant increase that people thought. Now, mind you, it was only a couple of areas that were tested across the province and in a municipal election, but it held steady. So I don't believe that solely one way is the only way. I think we need to explore those opportunities. And again, there are, a good portion of people that are nowadays online, but there are still some that are not. There's a lot of seniors who are on there, and that's great, but there are a lot who will tell you, well, that's long past my time and I have no interest in learning it. So realizing maybe there are mixed ways of doing business. Maybe the phone thing is, I don't know. I think there's a lot to be worked on here yet and debated before it's clearly defined what the end will look like for this bill. And it's good that the amendments were put forward. We heard, that the minister talked about third-party advertising. Well, I'll speak a bit about that. It's interesting how we look at third party. A lot of this is circled around the union involvement. We hear a lot about the unions. Well, I was a member of a union for a lot of years. I was a shop steward and negotiated contracts, Madam Speaker, and that was all fine. And I know an awful lot of union people who are certainly paramedics is the industry that I formerly came from. And I can say that decisions are being made, just as one example, and I'll just use a union example, to spend money, for example, on a third-party advertising type campaign, and we could say for a political party. My question would be, why did nobody ever come to me as a union member who pays union dues and says, is it all right if we put your money into supporting a political party? Now, I'm not opposed to maybe that idea, but perhaps there should be unanimous consent amongst all union members who are card-carrying, dues-paying, because it is their money that is endorsing a party or another. Perhaps if you're looking at fair ways to do it, if you're going to endorse one party, you endorse all parties that are registered as official parties, regardless of whether NDP or Liberal or Tory or Green or whatever they may be out there. And it should be with, we talk about just different ideas to throw out there and not being in a hurry to settle this issue of third-party advertising. And I agree with the former speaker who said, it shouldn't make the difference in whether or it shouldn't be undemocratic. It should all be fair. It should be democratic. There's no question about that. But the limits are interesting, and you can't quite follow the national model, I don't think, at $150,000 per riding. I don't think that's reasonable, one, nor fair. You can just imagine that not ever happening, I guess, in a small province like Nova Scotia. But there is probably a figure that could be used. So if this does go through as, this bill and having third-party advertising allowed to happen, we have to be very reasonable in what road we travel here by way of what kind of dollars and cents could be afforded. But again, it has to be fair for all. And some people will say, well, maybe there shouldn't be any third-party advertising. Well, there are some that do believe that. But on the other side of things, people are working hard out there trying to raise money for campaigns. And, advertising does cost a lot of money, just as an example. So that is one way that they do endorse it, or are able to cut some of the cost. But it has to be fair across the board, party-wise. It can't be just one way or the other, and it can't just be for one organization. And I only use the unions as one reference, but I think that there's probably other organizations, and I don't know of any right off the top of my head, that do support financially different parties. Who makes those decisions? Is it the CEOs and presidents and so on who are making decisions? I know that there are corporations over the years who have donated to all parties through various companies that they hold within a company. There's a number of ways of doing it, and there are loopholes that can be made. And we talked about some of the other reforms that had been done in years previous when it came to donating to a campaign. $1,000 per individual, and not more than $5,000, I believe it is, for a corporation. But Madam Speaker, that will be an ongoing issue, I think, and it'll be of great debate as we move forward, and it's far from being done. But it has to be transparent. The other piece of this third-party advertising is if you're going to allow it, Corporation A is going to have to show on the dotted line who they represent, who they are, not just a numbered company, and what value they donated or contributed in any way, and to whom. That's all part of being transparent and fair, and we talk about that being a big issue when it comes to integrity in this House, and we're a long ways from it. I don't think that we're close to that yet when it comes to getting these regulations in place, getting all the input that we need to push a bill through this House, and I hope that we're not in a hurry and we take the time that is absolutely necessary. But there are some interesting pieces in this bill that I do want to speak to, Madam Speaker, and they are some of the stuff that's, I know we can't go through clause for clause, but I do want to touch on a few things with regards to the education piece here and the instructions for these polling officers and election officers and how they conduct the polls and their responsibilities and so on, because in the past, there have been great discrepancies in how that business is carried out from poll to poll, from supervisor to supervisor and so on. And I don't know how that could possibly be, given that they all go to a training prior to elections polling day, and they are taught how, and it's provided books. I've seen the manuals that go out and so on, but there still have been some discrepancies in how the rules are applied. And of course, that is just differences of opinions of people, I guess is probably fair to say, when it comes to setting a final decision in the rule that will, you know, be decided on. And sometimes what's happened is that's discouraged voters, and this is all about trying to reach out to voters and encourage people to come to the polls and vote regardless of your age. But we heard a lot about 60%. I think this past election federally was 61, a little under 62%. And I think the last provincial election in my area was somewhere around 62%. That's very low. There's a huge percentage that aren't voting that we need to get there. So again, back to, you know, actually going, voting, trying to make this simple for people to come in. And a lot of times, for whatever reason, I mean, there have been people obviously that have voted their whole lives, but they still lack an understanding of what to bring when they come to the poll. And this last federal election was yet again another example. Nothing on that little card said bring your ID, you know, or you need to show a picture ID. We're not doing enough around telling all those of voting age where they should go, one, and how. There's confusion, and I understand it's a human resource issue and that people will make mistakes, and certainly machines will make mistakes by those entering the data, and that's all fine, but there has to be a way to make that a little better, and there has to be a way to inform people of what it is that they need to take with them when they vote. There have been issues around polling stations, Madam Speaker, where they wouldn't swear people in based on a variety of reasons. It's interesting, however, in a lot of these small towns and communities, you can go to the poll. You've lived in a community your whole life. You go to a poll and somebody says, oh, I don't know you all of a sudden, and you need an ID to cast your ballot. Seems a bit unreasonable as far as I'm concerned, and I know that the people that have been there have used a lot more harsher language than that when it comes to trying to cast their ballot over something so silly as an ID, which they weren't told in the beginning to bring. So I do hope that there's, in the regulation, it's very clear, and I hope in the instructions when they're given, that they do need to bring whatever it is they need. There needs to be communication. I see in the bill that there's an opportunity for communications by the elections officer. I hope that direction is not optional. I hope that that's clearly written in regulation, telling them what must be done, not what should be done, but what must be done in this case, to help encourage people to get out to vote, so when they get there, they're not discouraged and turn away after having a bad episode there and saying that they won't be back. That does nothing to help the process whatsoever. And certainly with new voters, Madam Speaker, the new voter coming in should be very well aware the very first time on what that process is, so that they know into future elections, whether it's municipal election, provincial or federal election, that they very clearly understand all of the rules and what they should bring and how easy it is to actually go and cast a ballot. Because it is, as we know, a very simple thing. The importance of it is another piece. You know, we do nothing, I shouldn't say nothing, we don't do very much when it comes to stressing the importance of why you should go and vote. Yeah, we had Democracy 250, traveled around the province, gave away all kinds of little trinkets. I don't know if that brought one voter, or did we ever go back and look at that and say, you know what, we did this and we did that, and we meeting after meeting, went to schools. I know the speaker, Madam Speaker, you weren't there at the time, but a former speaker traveled around the province and went to schools with the mace, and maybe the current speaker's doing that, and other speakers in this House probably have done that as well. What do we really know that has encouraged people to get out to vote? I don't think that we ever did any follow-up, and if we have, I haven't seen it. It should instill something in our kids to say, hey, what's this all about? Taking the mace there is a great idea. Having the speaker go there, you know, he's an important guy or gal, and he gives a wonderful presentation about what the House of Assembly is all about, but how much of that is captured really? And at what age groups are we doing it? We don't even have, I guess we don't have civics anymore in school or whatever we call it these days. I know we have political science. I guess maybe that's the right terminology, and it definitely is a science. There's no question about that, as we could all attest to in this House. Having gotten here, there is a bit of a science to all of it, every step of it. And and many strategies. But again, I don't know, I visited the grade 12 law classes and talked about legislation and how that process works, and there were, of a whole class, I think 2 kids that asked questions. So to me, that said, well, there were 2 kids of 20 that had an interest in what it was actually going on. And how many of them will vote? They're of age this year, who knows? But we have to reach out in some ways to try to increase voter participation, and we have to make it easier, not more difficult, as we move forward. And I hope through the instruction process that is in this bill and the regulations, again, it's not a should do, but a must do when it comes to teaching our new people coming to be supervisors and poll clerks and so on and so forth. Everybody has to be singing off the same song sheet and understand the rules clearly to make that happen. Now, the number of polling stations was also mentioned in here, and I know in my area, especially in some of the communities, I don't want to call them older communities, but the older people in some of the communities have always voted at polling station A over the years, and I have people tell me, nope, if I can't vote there next time, I am not going to vote. You know, I'm not going to Brooklyn. I live in Scotch Village. Why do I need to go to Brooklyn? And there are a variety of rules around that, I know, and there are certain must-haves like washroom facilities and so on for the people working, but the people understand that they want to cast a ballot. We're not making it easier. We tend to be making it more difficult in some ways, and it's important that we recognize the geographical issues, the demographics that are ever-changing, the older population who want to be able to easily and without taking a whole lot of time go and cast their ballot on election day. Madam Speaker, I don't think that we have spent a lot of time, but again, I hope that we spend a fair bit of time trying to figure out if we are going to make changes, what that does mean to populations in certain areas and certainly different age demographics, and informing them of how and why these changes are necessary. We talk about this all through the public communications and education, call it whatever you want. We, again, seem to struggle at times in something so simple, getting that out there, and we're not there for whatever reason. I want to talk a bit as well, Madam Speaker, I introduced a bill here, I think it was last fall, and maybe prior to that as well, that had to do with voting in hospitals. Now, I see in this bill that there was been something introduced, and I thought for a second maybe it covered it, but it doesn't, the way it reads. And it says residential center. And that residential center refers to a nursing home or special care home, assisted living facility, residential unit in a public hospital. And I'll give you an example of what that is, Madam Speaker. That is Halliburton Place, which is a nursing home facility in the Hants Community Hospital upstairs, using up one of the former wings. Or any other residential facility operated for the purpose of care and treatment of senior citizens, etc. But it does not get into what my point was, of people that are sick and unable to go out and vote. The mobile poll is right there, but yet it does not allow people across the hall in the hospital side to vote. They have to do that by other means and by other ballots. Well, that's easy to say if you've been there maybe, 2, 3 months, 6 months, a few weeks even, prior to the election or during the election, you could make arrangements for that. But if you go into the hospital partway through and you haven't voted in an advance poll or a continuous poll, and those are good things, and we'll talk more about that, there's no opportunity for the person in hospital to vote. It's taking away that, especially, if they're not able to get out. And a lot of times they're not. They're in a hospital for reasons because they're ill, but they could certainly make their way to a poll, a mobile poll in that facility and cast their ballot. And I'm not sure, how much logistics. I know that there'd be some, did you do other voting? How do you cross off that they voted or not? And I know that they do that anyway. They'd have their card, let's say it's for St. Croix, but they're in Windsor at the hospital. There has to be some way. And maybe that's during an advance poll. Maybe that polling takes place, mobile polling takes place during advance times. But no consideration, I don't think, is yet. I think he tried to pick up, the minister tried to pick up what I had introduced, but maybe not clearly. But it's very important. And Windsor Hospital is just one example and a small example because we have, a limited number of beds there. But you take in a hospital like Halifax where there's, the bigger regional hospitals where there could be hundreds of people actually in hospital, they would totally miss that opportunity to vote. And I'm sure have and will continue to do unless there are opportune changes that will be made. Halifax is a great example. Again, as I said, you have the Abbey J. Lane there where the veterans are. That would be classified in this bill as a residential center. they would be able to vote in that very building. That mobile poll would be in that very building. Yet across the hall and in other floors, no dice, can't cast a ballot, and they would miss out. So, you know, when we're trying to encourage voting, increased voting, it'd be interesting to know what percentage of those people did vote. Maybe we should be looking at that and saying, all right, how do we make that better? And I you know, in looking at this and detailing it as we have, I truly believe that there's a will to want to encourage that and a will to want to capture all of those people. And I know that, again, you know, with regards to those people in hospital who are not permanent residents, they're ill, but they're still in a hospital and have not had the opportunity to vote. But they would all get a card. You know, you have to present that card. You have to leave that card when you do vote. That could be done at the hospital, you know. I know it's no different than the nursing home or wherever it might be. They all get their cards. They're mailed out. You know, perhaps this is where the family of people who are sick would have to be, you know, helpful and committed to, you know, Dad might say, call up and I bring my card in. I want to be able to vote. But if we're not producing the opportunity to vote, I mean, they can't even leave right now, Unit 200, go through a set of doors into Halliburton Place and vote. They should be able to, because you should be able to vote anywhere by getting sworn in. Show your ID and cast your ballot. But that's not happening. We don't make that happen. And, you know, as I said, in a small facility like Windsor, a small facility like Hants Community Hospital, or a smaller facility, I know that there's some even smaller than that, but there are a number of patients there who miss that opportunity. But we should look at it and say, you know, how many didn't get the chance to vote because they were in hospital? Well worth looking into, in my opinion, and I know it's hard enough when we take the mobile poll to, you know, to the Windsor Elms and Dykeland Lodge and Halliburton and any residential care facility, nursing home-wise, to try to capture that vote. Those that are able do, and generally speaking, those that are not miss that opportunity to vote, even though they are, in all likelihood, sent the proper documentation to do so. And I'm sure throughout the course of their life have many times, but still miss that opportunity due to their medical condition. So again, it's you know, a missed opportunity there. And I know that there are rules around assisting somebody to vote, but I also know that there are rules around those people who are sometimes just not able to make a decision as well. And we are not able, you know, obviously not able to make decisions for others, regardless of, you know, we hear a lot about how maybe our fathers and our grandfathers and so on and so forth were very strong, whatever. We may not necessarily be very strong one way or the other. We know that that's changing. That's not necessarily a bad thing, you know. The partisan piece of that is less and less, I think, from what I see at least. And I know that you'll always have the diehard NDP vote. You'll always have the diehard Tory. You'll always have the diehard Liberal. When I say always, maybe you will, maybe you won't. Maybe that'll continue to change as the demographic changes and the older people move on. You know, Madam Speaker, it's hard to say, but we have seen changes. We do know that we have seen changes in the way votes occur and in different demographics, different age groups. And, you know, hence the reason that this bill is quite worthy, because there are changes that are occurring out there and we should be changing and modernizing with it. And we have presented a bill in this House, the Modernizing Government Act. As you know, that we are in favor of updating changes and wanting to make it easier for people to vote, Madam Speaker. But again, I just want to stress that piece about the hospital. I do hope that the Minister takes into consideration some of these comments. And I know that, again, it would be maybe a bit difficult. I'm not sure, but they would get the card. There would be a process. I don't see it being any more of a process than what we've seen, you know, in a regular poll or a mobile poll. They're assisted to wherever they need to be, and as long as they're capable, Madam Speaker, to cast that ballot, then so be it. They should be given the opportunity, not taken away. And one of the other pieces that we need to consider when we're looking at this other, you know, 38 or 40% or what we're not capturing is our schools, our other organizations. There's a lot of organizations out there that people are members of, you know, the Lions, the Rotary, etc. I don't think, and I've been a Rotarian for quite a few years, and I don't think anybody's ever came and presented and said, you know what, this is why we cast ballots. This is why it's important to vote, or this is how you vote. This, the real simplicity of it all. That's never happened, and I'm sure in the Gyros and in the Lions, I've never heard of anyone ever coming out. I've never heard of any documentation ever being sent out. But those are options, you know, when we talk about ideas and how to. The simple one for the youth is obviously through the school system, in my opinion. It's, maybe it's not political science anymore. Maybe it is truly democracy class, or it's a civics class, or whatever you want to call it. I know that there are teachers in here who could probably call it whatever it used to be, and maybe you look back and there were times when we could show that there were, when we had those classes, that there were proof, for lack of a better term. I guess it said so many people voted. The numbers were obviously higher in years past, or at least we think they were higher in years past, and we know that they were. But they are going down, and it is a bit of a struggle. And you have to ask yourself, what is fair? We heard others talk about, 50% of that cast ballot being in the favor and a majority before a member should be elected. Well, I don't know that I agree with that totally. People are voting. It's a majority that gets you here, and the majority that you work for. You work for everyone, as we all know, but it's the majority that do get you here. What would that mean? Another round of ballots? If there are 4 on it, then you take the top 3, the top 2. Is that the way that they're projecting that at work? I don't think it is, but that's sort of what I took from it. If that were the case, you can only imagine the extra costs that would be involved in trying. And at that point, what would you really be getting? Would you be getting 50%? 50% of what? 50% of 60%? Still interesting math, no matter how you do it. So I'm not sure that I really agree with it has to be 50% plus 1 of the polling results on election day. I don't know that that's totally reasonable, because I don't know how many people do. I certainly know that there are some in this House who poll well over 50%, but I don't know how many. I know a former member from Cumberland County polled somewhere in the high 70s or 80% on polling day, but he was a very fine and good member, as are all members in this House, but not all members are able to poll like that. And the new member for Cumberland County, I'm hearing, got 60-odd% of the vote as well. So. But we know that there are a lot of times close races, and I don't want to make it sound biased, because I was in a close race once and it was 46 votes, my first campaign, and the percentage, of course, was, I don't know, maybe you work it out as 0.0 something percent, and after recounts that are all fine, and you move forward. But I'm not sure that that taking somebody off of the ballot to make that happen, taking off the bottom 2 and allowing the next 2 to go for another round, how is that democratic? That's as if it's an NDP and a Tory, then it leaves the Liberal off the ballot. How is that fair when it comes to democracy? I'm not sure that it is. So I don't totally understand where he was going with that, and I certainly don't agree with it totally. It's the majority of vote that it takes to get here, and the majority of people in any constituency or riding, regardless of the level of government, get you where you need to be, and it's expected that you as a member, Madam Speaker, and I, and all members of this House, regardless of the percentage or the numbers of votes cast, have an opportunity, but more importantly, a duty to represent each and every person in our constituencies, whether you have 10 or 15,000. I know in mine I've got somewhere around 15,000 voters, and when you take in the under 18s, it's somewhere around 20 or 21,000, I believe I represent. And doesn't matter to me what their partisan politics are, and a lot of them, I can tell you, don't have a partisan way about them. A lot of people will tell you, yeah, I voted every way that there is to vote, but you hear a lot more about that and why they're voting and how they're voting. And it all makes a difference. So again, I'm not sure, you can't focus on partisan politics. We spend 30 days trying to tell everybody why we're different, and then we spend 4 years trying to tell everybody why we're the same. I always found it a very unique business, when you're out there, because you are working for everybody, and it never mattered to me. I've had people call me on the phone, I remember in 2006 when I was first elected, and said, look, I'm this or I'm that, you probably won't do anything for me because I'm not a Tory. Well, that doesn't matter to me. Did you vote? Yes, I voted. Great. That's what matters. But we work for them all, whether they vote or they don't. And those that don't will tell you, I don't vote. Well, you try to encourage them, and they do. And I tell them, it doesn't matter who you vote for. Go vote. Cast your ballot, and at the end of the day, they'll all be counted, and somebody will represent you, whether it's myself or someone else on the ballot. Someone will come to this place, and they will represent you as they should. And they will talk about all these bills, and that's democracy. That's a good thing. Regardless of where we've been, this is, I think, one of the best countries in the world, and we will probably all share that. And we live in not too bad a province as far as that goes. When we look at other issues across the country, our democracy is alive and well here, I think. People have the opportunity. There's nobody standing outside a polling booth with a rifle in their hand or a machine gun or anything like that saying, you know, you must vote this way. Doesn't happen. We're very fortunate. Hopefully that will never happen in this country. You know, I understand and appreciate in other areas that that is not the way that it is, and as hard as Canadians try to do their piece, and a good many from this province as well, who are certainly representative of the military, who are overseas and places like Afghanistan trying to create freedom, you know, it's a hard battle. We're lucky we don't have to battle that here. Our battle is getting them out. Our battle is trying to get them to the polls, not shunning them away from the polls. We have to determine or find a new way to make that happen. And I was excited to hear the minister speak today a little bit when he talked about his amendments, and one of them being the youth participation. Now, this interesting idea of having kids who are 16 to 18 years old at the polls and working, that's a great thing. I think it's an opportunity for my daughter, who's going to turn 16 this week. The next time there's an election, well, perhaps she'll probably be 18, I guess, and able to vote. But I hope that she would take an opportunity to go in and actually really learn about it. Now, she's probably not a great example because they've had the pleasure of being in this house and seeing how things do operate to some degree, and they understand it really well. Didn't discourage her, no, Keith. It didn't discourage her, and I'm glad it didn't discourage her. Just, you know, did she have a few questions about some of the things that go on? I think probably everybody that's ever stood in this chamber or ever been a guest and watched some of the goings on here has probably had a question or two about any number of things about process. But, you know, that's fair. That's reasonable. This is their house. This is the people's house. But I hope her and her friends and others take the opportunity in the next election, say, you know what, I want to be a poll clerk, or I want to go count ballots when it's all over. I want to see how the process works from start to finish. I think that's a big piece of trying to encourage our young kids how to get out there and cast that ballot and why it's important, and to get them excited about it. Now, the federal election, a lot of people argue, you know, shouldn't have had a federal election. I agree. Nobody really needed a federal election. And the money that was spent and so on. But guess what? We had a federal election. It was caused, it was had, and it started off kind of dull, Madam Speaker. It really did. It was kind of dull. Nobody, you know, talking about it much, and saw a few signs go up. And as it went on, though, it got a little better, like it always does. But it's something that I've referred to as it started kind of dull, but ended with a bang. And there was so much going on toward the end of it, you know, in trying to, not just myself, as somebody who has a little knowledge of politics, and I wouldn't say a lot, but a little knowledge of politics, who's very interested in it. I see the Minister of Finance over there getting a chuckle out of that. He caught it. But anyway, Madam Speaker, you know, people were engaged. They were excited to see it going on. Now, still, the increase in the percentage of the vote didn't really go up, less than 62%. It's incredible. But there were a lot of people paying attention. There were a lot of people talking about this and talking about that. And, you know, the media does a fine job of instilling whatever it is that they'd like to instill, whether it be positive or negative, or who's going to get in, and all the guesses and the pollsters. And there was a lot going on. It ended with a bit of a big, huge bang. And I don't say that, Madam Speaker, because of the end results. I say that because of the interest that kept building toward the end of it. So how do you take that interest that builds toward the end of a campaign like that and convert it in that last week to getting people out to vote? Because as big a bang as that had toward the end, we did not see it carried over with the percentage of vote that got out. So it is exciting to see some of the youth, you know, the 16 years and up, and I know other members in this House, the Liberal Party had put forward a bill about 16-year-olds being able to vote. Well, I can say that I don't disagree with, I do disagree, sorry. I don't agree with that simply because I'm not sure at 16 years old, I'm really not sure, and maybe I'm wrong, I'm only one opinion. I'm not sure that unless you were going to take the time to educate those 16-year-olds clearly, democratically, on all the options that you had. And not just say, you know what, I'm a Tory, and dear Erica, you should vote Tory because I'm a Tory. I don't believe that's the right way. I believe you should instill in these kids the reason why you're a Tory, or you're a Liberal, or you're an NDP, or you're a Green, and whatever other parties that might come along in the years ahead. They can drive at 16. They can drive at 16. That's what one of the members just called. Yeah, they can drive at 16, and I'm not so sure, having a daughter who's just turning 16, that I'm all that excited about that. Because she's saying, Dad, I want to take my money out of the bank and I want to go and get on this Excel driving program and learn how to drive. And I'm thinking, oh my, I'm glad I'm not teaching you, because I don't think I could do it. And I've taught lots of people to drive, old girlfriends and stuff like that, and I'm still trying to, I was going to say I'm still trying I'm still trying to teach my wife a little bit more about driving better. She would disagree. Yeah, she would disagree with that statement, but, you know, maybe not. Anyway, I'm not excited about my 16-year-old driving. And I think that there's a maturity level, and all kids are different, and all people are different, and some kids don't mature until they're a little bit older. And, you know, I know there's a lot around that, but unless you're going to provide something to these, you know, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, and so on, and educate them why it's important, one, to vote. And I think it's great that these kids would want to vote. But I do know at the school, I think Evanview and other schools, maybe it was the middle school this year, Haines West Middle School, held a vote of their own on how it would go. And I'm anxious because I haven't seen the results of that yet. And they just named candidates for parties. And I think maybe that one of them told me they had used my name. Well, I don't know, because it was I don't know what the results were. Perhaps I was beaten badly in that school vote. I don't know. But I can tell you it's encouraging that they're doing that, because that's education. But Madam Speaker, it's important if we're, you know, even an 18-year-old going to cast a ballot, 19 years old, 20 years old, who don't have a lot of experience. I know that when we were young, we all thought we had all the experience that was required. Whether we got behind the wheel and we're heading down the road, or we're going to a movie, or we're going to our friend's house, we all knew everything about everything, or at least we thought we did. But as time went on and we got out of school and we got jobs and mortgages and cars and kids came along, we learned a lot about not knowing much of anything. And you learned again along the way. Life does mean something. The experiences mean something. And being educated means something, especially, they'll let us know. Yeah, they'll let us know. Thank you, Stu. It's important that these kids know why they have the opportunity to go to that poll on polling day, whether it's advanced poll, special poll, write-in poll, continuous poll, as I now see presented in this, this document, why they're going to vote. Do most people understand, Madam Speaker? Do you think? Do most people understand in this country, around the world, why they have the opportunity to vote? Do they clearly understand, or is there something that just think, oh, I got to go vote because I can, and it's election time again, and I'm a diehard this or that, or I want to change something, and I'm going to go vote for so-and-so, and do they really understand? I'm not so sure that everybody does. I think that the older demographic does, because they came through an era in their lives that taught them some things. Times weren't always easy. Times were difficult. We went through world wars. We went through other wars. They understand the cause of freedom. I'm not sure that our young, I don't want to say don't, but I'm not sure that they're as clear why it is that they're free today to do that. So I think there's a huge piece. I don't know what history teaches us anymore. I know when I went to school, I learned all about American history. I could have told you anything about American history. Couldn't tell you anything about Canadian history unless I learned it on myself, which I did learn on myself. I'm a bit of a history nut when it comes to our own maritime history, and specifically provincial history. I like that more than most. But I can tell you, there's a lot to getting these kids involved, whether it's just going to polls and working. And if you're going to give them that opportunity to work, and I think that's good, that you give them the opportunity, that the minister's added it to the bill, but tell them why they're there. They're not just there to collect $50 or $100 or whatever they might pay you these days. I have no idea what a polling clerk or one of these people make. I know parties pay agents, I guess, sometimes to go in and do work and so on. They're not just there for the money. They're there to learn what the process is about. They're there to learn the importance of why we are actually having an election, what's going to happen, what the potentials are, Madam Speaker, what the outcomes could possibly be. And as we saw in the last recent federal election, the outcomes can be very surprising, unexpected. Now, I don't know, I've talked to anybody who wasn't very surprised at the recent outcome. Well, surprised they may be, doesn't matter. It's all about going forward. What will government do? What will those elected officials do regardless of the party they represent or how many of them there are? Doesn't matter. They still have a job to do, and their work is at home representing the individuals that put them there. Doesn't matter what their politics are. That's their job. Do we understand that? Do the members going forward, do the members that were elected understand that? I hope that they do. We heard some discussion about how one member never even campaigned. Well, there's a reason for that, and I think it's probably fair to say we know what that is. Their name went on the ballot. We see it all the time. That's not immune to this business. We know that, okay, we want to make sure that we have someone in every riding in the country, all 308, and I'll use even our province, all 52 ridings and our constituencies, not ridings, constituencies, in this province want to have a name on the ballot. I've seen it where that's not new here. I've seen an election, a previous election here, where a name was thrown on a ballot and they never even showed up to campaign. So they knew that they weren't going to win, and of course they know through polling and so on and so forth. But can we now look at that and say that that's even reasonable? We just saw again, I talked about how dull. Who would have ever thought what happened in the province of Quebec was going to happen? Nobody in week 1 or 2 anticipated that, did they? Don't think so, Madam Speaker. That all happened near the end when we saw the decline. You know, people had to change for some reason. Something was instilled in people in the province of Quebec who said, okay, it's time for a change. That wasn't present on day 1. It wasn't there. It wasn't present on day 2 or on week 2. It came about in the last couple of weeks. Now, what helped that over the top? Well, pollsters were there and they were doing their thing. The media were there, they were doing their thing. The media and drive an election campaign, it's incredible how much, I'll use the word power, or I'm not sure what the word is, to instill people's thinking. Influence is one, power may be another. There's a whole variety of names you could probably use to describe how this goes. And when you talk about democracy, is that democratic? How democratic is the influence of the media? Well, the media would say, well, right to free speech, I agree with that. Well, good. It's all about what people buy, what they believe when they read that line. And I always say when I read articles in the paper, doesn't matter what paper, and I don't even need to mention any, there's a line that's missing, and it's a line of fact, generally speaking, in between every other line. When you read a lot of stories, you'll see, and you'll know different, because you were there. And pictures, well, worth 1,000 words. Is that not the statement? Picture's worth 1,000 words. Doesn't mean it has to be accurate. What is perceived in that picture? What is perceived in the article? Depending on how you read the article, it could be a story about any member in this House, and you said, that's not what I said. That's not what I meant. Doesn't matter what it is. It's about how it's interpreted. That's right, Minister. It's about how it's interpreted. And people are just human. They'll interpret things. Thank you. People will interpret things how they wish. And if they think that there's a great movement toward change, perhaps they'll jump on that bandwagon and they'll be part of that. Is that right or wrong? It doesn't matter. It's democratic. It is their free right to do just that. They, the people of this province and of this country, will and must, after having the opportunity to cast that ballot, stand up and take responsibility for their actions. So if people aren't happy, I did. Okay, Minister. Sorry, Madam Speaker, I got the Minister there throwing me off a little bit. I forgot where I was. But anyway, it is.
Percy, you know I'm better looking.
He's better looking, Percy, better looking. Madam Speaker, I'm getting back to the bill, Madam Speaker. I'm trying not to be discouraged and influenced by some of the other people around this House, Madam Speaker. As you can see how easy it is to do that. So that's a great example, which really references what I was speaking to. People want to get on and they want to say, I want to be part of that winning team, or I think that's exciting and I'm going to be part of that. But that is free, that is democratic. There's nothing wrong with that. But people need to stand up and they need to take responsibility for their actions after they vote. People will need to stand up and take responsibilities for the recent vote that they just cast. You hear a lot about Stephen Harper and majority government, and sometimes people aren't happy with it, and it doesn't matter which radio station you listen to or which columnists you read or which poll you look at. There's good and there's bad to both by way of comments. We'll really know what's good and we'll really know what's bad by the end result, Madam Speaker, and nothing more. And it will be the same as any government. It will be the same as the current government we have in Nova Scotia. The NDP are here. People voted a majority government in this province. We have to accept that and respect those decisions, which we do. I do. And I tell people when they're not happy, okay, if you're not happy, you'll have an opportunity when the time comes. Stand up and take responsibility for your actions, because the majority of people obviously voted for a majority government. That's democratic. Complain all you like, or not. Maybe you're happy, maybe you're not. One thing that we do know is it doesn't matter who's in government, people are not always happy. That's for certain. So they have the opportunity, fortunately, in this case, 4 years, a couple more years to go yet probably, and I'm guessing, before we'll have another provincial election. And I think that people are happy that they're not going to the polls or threatening to go to the polls, and that was a result of the recent federal election. Democratically, they said, okay, it's time. It's my right to say, I don't want this anymore. We have the opportunity to do that, and we have to make sure that we respect that, Madam Speaker. The continuous polls should be interesting. Now, I thought in previous elections that in this province we were able to go to the returning office where Elections Nova Scotia was set up in our local area, and I believe it was the same in the most recent federal election. You could vote any day at that poll up to the day before, I guess, or the day of advanced polling day. Now, maybe that's just a new name for it, but I thought that that rule always existed. But there were people who did not know, strangely enough, and still don't know, so that opportunity does exist to go and vote, because they think, pardon me, they think that because I'm at work every day, I don't have an opportunity to do it, what have you. It will be very good, and again, it's about educating Nova Scotians that they can go to these continuous polls, that they can vote. They don't have to wait for advanced polling day. They do not have to wait till election day. And now I do know in talking to some people, it doesn't matter. They say, we're waiting until election day. It's something I've always done and I'm not going to change. That's fine. We respect that as well. But we do all try, and part of getting that vote out is obviously through the ability to have such a thing as the continuous poll open, and certainly the advanced polls. We work hard at trying to get the vote out as well, because we know that people are busy. They're working, they're doing whatever, and I know that there are rules around a few hours and letting people off of their job or wherever they're employed to go and vote on election day, and that's fine. How many really do, I don't know. But again, if we're looking at trying to increase the vote, getting out the vote, we have to figure out how to make it easier, and I believe that this continuous poll is a great opportunity, provided that we tell people. So when we are sending out that little card, it says, here's your card to take to the polls. Here's your card to vote with. There's not enough information, obviously, on it. There's a phone number, and you can call Elections Nova Scotia or Elections Canada, or whatever the election might be, or your local municipal unit, perhaps, when the time comes for that, Madam Speaker. But we need to, it's a fairly big card. There's lots of room on there. Don't just put, if you have questions, call. We should be putting advanced polling days, hours. We should be putting the continuous polls open every day. There's lots of room to put stuff on there. And one of the things we should definitely be putting on this card is bring your ID with you so that it is clear. Put it in a big bold color, something that stands out. Maybe it's blue, I don't know, or orange or yellow or whatever the color might be. Madam Speaker, it doesn't matter. But you got to bold it and you got to put it out there. Bring your ID with you. So many people still don't know that. But you know, continuous polls, I think it's good. I think we should list it. And I think we need to educate people that this is a change, because there'll be a lot of people who are not paying attention to this debate or not watching it, don't have the time to watch this debate. It'll be a couple years probably, as I said, that'll go by. This bill will get through. How many people will pick this bill up and just read it at their leisure? You know, something to put you to sleep at night, perhaps. You know, depending on how you look at this stuff. Probably not many, it's fair to say, unless you're involved in the process. i.e. the people within this house that work here and so on, people that work for us in our offices, people who are politically motivated, Madam Speaker, will not read this. Candidates won't even read this in all likelihood until they're making decisions toward the next election. So there has to be a way to make sure that people, in general, the voting public, are aware that there is a new Elections Act in the province of Nova Scotia, and you have the opportunity on these days, and this is how, and this is why. These are the directions. It's not that hard, but yet we've not been able to capture that in years past, and it makes it difficult. And again, as candidates running with our name on the ballot, what's our goal? Our goal is to get people to the poll. And yes, we'd like them all to vote for us. Sure we would. We know that's not realistic, but we need people to get to the poll. Now, in some cases, the majority vote for us, which is not a bad thing. We're able to get here and we're able to represent them, as I said before. But again, I think it's a really good thing that we're seeing some changes in the polls. The poll locations are important to people. I want to stress that. I want to stress, just again, very much touching on the hospital piece. I don't know, how much time do I have left, Madam Speaker?
Sorry?
Time?
Around 11 minutes.
11 minutes, thank you.
13, sorry, 13 minutes.
13 minutes, that's better math, thank you. I appreciate that. So there's been some issues with registering that I know that I've dealt with in previous elections, and again in this federal election, registering the list of electors and how that's created. And I know that there's a census that's being done, and I think I've heard recently commercials around the importance of doing our census. We've made them available to do online. Even doing them by hand is really only minutes. I did mine the other day when it came, and I don't know, it might have taken me, I'm going to say 10 minutes at the very most to whip through that, and there were 5 of us. They aren't asking a whole lot. It doesn't take much. You can go online. It's probably even much quicker to do it online. And so we have to stress, you know, we know that the census is important. I won't argue short form, long form. I don't even know what this form is. It was a long form to me. I rolled it out and it had a whole bunch of stuff on it. But I can't tell you what version of it was. I just filled it out. But the importance of that obviously goes without saying. It tells you, obviously there's some census data that goes back to Elections Canada, Elections Nova Scotia in the end when it comes to election time. And it says, okay, these are the list of electors in your area. And we know that they're off. I don't know what other members are like. I know that my area, there's probably 15,000 names on it, but we know that people move, and for whatever other reasons, people obviously pass on, and the list is sometimes not up to date. Now, fortunately, we'll have something here that should be fairly close to being up to date within, you know, maybe a year or a year and a half, 2 years, when it comes time to getting that right. I do know that there are some sensitivities around people not wanting to give information, but there have been assurances by government that this information will be kept and not given out to, you know, the local flyer company who wants to call you every night at supper time and try to sell you something that you don't need. And again, you know, it's important that these people get that census done. It's important that the list is accurate and up to date. And again, it's part of encouraging people how to vote, because there are a lot of people, if they don't fill out the census, perhaps they don't realize if they don't fill out the census, there's a chance that they won't get an opportunity to vote because the card won't come, Madam Speaker. So maybe there's some relationship to that we have to instill in people that says, this is why you fill it out. You know, they know, and mine, and I'll just speak to my own, that my daughter's going to turn 16 years old. Perhaps by the next election, when they're looking at the census, they'll know that she's voting age. Perhaps they'll send that card to her in the mail. Won't be an issue. Creates another person who says, oh yeah, I can vote now. Here's my card. I can go vote, Madam Speaker. So it will make a difference. And we need, again, as I said, I heard a couple of commercials about trying to encourage people to go to the polls and to vote. And Mr. Speaker, welcome back. I got a bit of a highlight here that the minister provided just on the chief electoral officer, and they talked about, you know, the improved access to voting opportunities, and I had highlighted some of the things here, the mobile polls and the broader category of residential centers, and I talked about those. And I want to, and a new poll type, which of course is a continuous poll, Mr. Speaker. And the independence of the chief electoral officer I want to touch on just for a few minutes before I finish up my time here on this hour. And interesting how we're going to bring this all in. Here we have the chief electoral officer, was currently Christine McCullough, I believe is her name. She has had a lot to do with this, and I know that she's been there through previous elections, and I do want to say that she has been very helpful when we've had issues in our constituency, and I think I know that there were calls made through the people that work in the Elections Nova Scotia office and regional office, who were great as well. Ken Sears was one of the gentlemen who worked in my office locally, a fine gentleman who did a great job in my opinion, and when he didn't know, he knew right where to go, and Ms. McCullough was very good at, you know, helping him through that process and answering questions, and things seemed to work out. So I think that she has a lot to offer to this entire process, making it totally independent, taking it out of the hands, you know, taking the politics out of it, and I really hope that that's where it goes. There's always seemed to be this flavor of politics involved in it and who makes what rules, and I hope what she has, and I think what she will have, is a great ability to add to this in the end, and I'm sure she's been adding all the way along by way of developing the bill and setting the rules, but the regulations are going to be an important part. It's one thing to write the piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, as you and I both know. It's another thing to draft the regulations. So I can see why the minister is probably anxious to get the bill through, looking at time frames and next elections and having this in place and an opportunity to get it out and to educate people and provide it for them. It's going to take some time, I think, to develop what will be good, will be solid regulations around this particular bill, because I don't think it's as easy as one might think. And I think that this accountability, or the chief electoral officer, is going to have an awful big role to play in doing just that, because he or she in this case are going to be sort of the top person that's going to make final decisions, and who's going to have something to reference. And in this case, she is going to have a great deal to reference, not only a bill that's numerous pages. I think it's 117 pages, what I read this weekend, since getting it on Friday. She's going to have an awful lot to go through. I'm sure she'll know it inside out prior to an election coming, having been part of developing it. And certainly the regulations around each and every clause in the bill. That will be where the devil is in the detail, as we know, we refer to, Mr. Speaker, because those will be the things that are important to us as members. Those will be the things that are important to candidates, official agents, and so on and so forth, and all of those people who are involved in the real aspect of, the official agents, who have an enormous amount of work to do. And it sounds like a pretty small title, but it's probably the biggest title in all of the campaign, as you and I would both know. That person has great responsibilities, and they have to have a go-to. They have to be able to say, this has to be clear. That's all part of this reform when it comes to what's good for Nova Scotians. Not just good for candidates and political parties, but what's good for Nova Scotians, what will work for them, and what's fair. Most importantly, what's fair. This process has to be a fair one, it has to be a democratic one, and it has to be one that is going to encourage the voter to come out. So again, we remember, what are we going to do to get that vote out? Will this bill and the little bit of media, well, maybe it'll get a lot of media, I don't know, Mr. Speaker, in days, but you know what it's like, it's a story for a day or two, then it goes away. How do we get it back? And we see all kinds of reports crafted in this House and generated on this subject and that department, and it doesn't matter what it is. You and I both see them come through this House, and throughout the course of the year, the paper that is generated is just absolutely unbelievable. A lot of reports that come in and they get shelved, and no one will ever read them. In my office, I put them out in my waiting area, so if people have any interest at all in looking at some of the things that government does and reports that are generated, they're there. To date, I don't know of anyone that's ever picked one up and looked at it. If we have questions around some of them, and when constituents do come in, I pull them out, we'll open it up, and we'll see what's available to them, and sometimes the reports are valuable. I shouldn't say sometimes, that's not really fair. If used the way that they're intended to be used and the reason that they were developed for, I think that there's great opportunity, and there's probably some good material in each of the reports that are put forward. But again, people don't take advantage of that because we don't do a good job of selling it. It gets put around here to 52 members and thrown in a drawer, and maybe that's where it ends up. But we have to be able to get this out to the public in a way that is meaningful. And I'm not talking about commercials with maybe people from here out there doing having opportunities to sell something. And I'm not necessarily saying that works, but there has to be something that follows this. So a good piece of legislation, a good regulations that go along with it, and then when it comes time, or we know that we're coming up on elections, and maybe that's where, in some provinces or countries, fixed election dates mean things. They have the opportunity maybe 3, 4, 6 months in advance to say, don't forget, this is part of how the process works, to potential candidates that may be interested, to party people that may be interested. We know that there'll be significant rule changes, so everybody should be interested, but more importantly to the voters to say, okay, these are the simple pieces. How do I get my little card? Oh, it will come by this date. After the writ is dropped, it arrives at, a week later or 2 weeks later or whatever the prior number of days. And if you don't get it by then, this is what you should do. People don't get it. Well, I never got my card, so I didn't go vote. Well, that's not good enough. That's a failure on our part. That's a failure on, people that are out there, but they're only doing the best they can with what they have. We know that as well. And it comes back to that census bit again. If we don't do the census every once in a while and we don't provide the information, then sometimes Elections Canada or Elections Nova Scotia don't know, or municipal units don't know when it's time every 4 years. Now, I think they've got the best deal going. They have set election dates. They know exactly when the next one will be in 2012. They'll be out there campaigning. We know that. But people that are interested will say, okay, maybe long about August, I'm going to start knocking on a few doors. I know that's what I did. The year that I ran in 2004, I started knocking on doors in late August, even before I had my nomination paper filled out, to get a feel for what this was about and learn a little something about it and hear what the people in town had to say. Now, maybe that helped get me elected that year. I don't know, because there was a competition. But I can tell you there was a benefit to that, not only to me as a candidate, but I think the people said, oh yeah, you know what, there's an election coming up. We probably should be thinking a bit about that. And people were. But there was also a process opportunity there that people had to learn. Myself as a candidate, other people that ran as candidates, people who were working, who had done it numerous times, Mr. Speaker, who had been through this process as workers, still had forgotten over the course of those years. And here we are, who people will forget again, because 4 years is a fairly long time. And there are people that will say, oh, I've worked elections ever since I've been alive. You know, there's the regulars, we call them. They work and work and work, and that's great. Wonderful to have them people. But there's still new things. And what we do know, in a document this size, they'll go, oh, this is the rule book now? This isn't even half of it. By the time the regulations are drafted, it'll be twice that and more probably. So there's going to have to be people that know what their role is. And my thought is, well, okay, if you're a poll clerk, you photocopy out the piece that says poll clerk and the regulations that go with that, and that's how you teach it and you get it right. I don't know, that seems rather simple, but maybe that works. But you have to be able to help people get the job done and get it done correctly. And if you don't do that, that's going to create other issues. And the last thing you want to do is create issues on polling day. You don't want a disagreement between someone coming in the door who says, well, I didn't get my card, but I want to vote. Well, that's happened. People don't get the card, but they think they can't vote because they don't have a card. Well, you can. You go, you sign your oath, you swear in, or you get somebody to verify and swear in that says, I am this person, and I swear that to be true. And it's really, really, really simple. But it appears to some people that it's a very I don't want to bother, I didn't get my card. So we also have to get that message out. And obviously you can't put that on a card if you haven't got it, but you have to be able to get that out there. You have to be allowed to do that as a candidate if you're going to throw out advertising material. You know, most of us probably have put advertising material out as members, certainly, newsletters and what have you. We've put stuff out during campaigns that say this, this, and this. We certainly have to be allowed to put on this is important in some fashion, and maybe that's standardized. You know, maybe every party has to use a standard ad on their documentation going out that says everybody can recognize this regardless if they're getting material from this party or this candidate. Doesn't matter. One thing should be standard here, and that's just another idea that it all looks the same, everybody's selling the same message, so there's no confusion. Official agent stuff. My time is up already, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity this evening to have the hour goes by fast. So with that, thanks very much, and I'll take my seat.
Thank you. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to speak on some of the highlights of the new Elections Act. And I think what I'll do is, first off, I'll focus on what is a major concern for the Liberal Party, which would be the exclusion of the third-party financing or advertising provisions. And this actually had a great deal of interest for me because back in 1997, there were no limits on third-party advertising. And so when the federal election occurred that year, there was an organization that's still around today, the National Citizens Coalition. And the National Citizens Coalition decided that they would take out some ads against a number of candidates throughout the country. Yes, well, my colleague just asked, like whom, for example? And, well, it just happened to be that year, they decided to take some advertisements out against the youngest member of Parliament in Nova Scotia, who I just happened to be married to him. And so that's how I know this story. But in that particular election, the National Citizens Coalition decided to run radio ads and say that if this particular member were re-elected, he would he'd be able to collect $1 million pension. So suddenly, a member who was in his mid-30s was subjected to advertisements by an organization that had no limits on how much it was going to advertise, and there were no ramifications for this organization if what it was saying was not true. Now, I suppose in some fantasy world, that pension, if he had been re-elected at that time, would have added up to $1 million. But at $30,000 a year, it would have been quite a long time before that added up. And plus, there had been some new changes that had come in so that MPs who were defeated and who had been vested in their pensions could not begin collecting those pensions until age 55. So unlike in the past, where if a member were vested after 6 years and 2 terms, they could begin collecting right away, the amounts were lower, and you could not collect until age 55. I have to tell you that I had neighbors who had been all gung-ho, were going to support the Liberal member for Halifax West until those ads began airing. And I had neighbors who couldn't even look at me because they thought that my husband would begin collecting $1 million pension if he were re-elected. And you could sit down and explain, stop and think about this, $30,000, the inflation rate would have to be massive to get up to the $1 million mark. It didn't matter. There was no control on the National Citizens Coalition how much money they spent, and there was no necessity for them to actually tell the truth. And there would be no penalty for them if they didn't. And so I have to say, ever since that, and yes, my husband lost, but then he came back 3 years later. But anyway, but the thing was, when that happened, I realized the power of third-party advertising. And ever since then, I have felt very strongly that that was a case where a member who had controls on how much money he spent could not respond effectively to an organization that had no controls on what it spent. And that didn't seem fair to me. The irony of all of this was that my husband was one of the people who had actually pushed to have pension rules changed, so you had to be older to be able to collect it, and the amount was lower. But that didn't matter. It was easier to inflate the numbers with a really young guy, and so that's what they did. And my concern about third-party advertising is that without controls, it means organizations, and that could be corporations, industry groups, it could be unions, their voices are louder than the actual candidates who are running. And because the candidates have controls on the money they're spending, but these organizations, if this bill were to go forward unamended, do not, it's not really a level playing field. And it also begs the question, where's the voice of the people who do not have money? So for poverty groups, for example, that may not have money, where is their voice? What I think we don't want is the kind of system where we see in the US where advertising, negative advertising, although Lord knows we've had enough of that, negative advertising continues for a really long time in advance of an election. I mean, sometimes it just seems like in the US it's a never-ending election cycle. And I think that's what happens when there's no control on advertising. Again, we are referring to an election cycle and not to the lead up to one. But if we don't have some kind of a control, money buys elections. My concern about excluding third-party advertising from this bill is that the minister was just outside the chamber, and he indicated to reporters that he hadn't read the report before introducing the bill. And I find that, I guess, kind of surprising, because I would have thought that would be job one before drafting the bill. But apparently the bill was drafted before the report was even issued. So I have to say, I think this is a case of putting the cart before the horse. And the minister indicated he hadn't thought about third-party advertising, and I have to ask, why not? It certainly has been a factor in elections here. And in fact, every other jurisdiction in the country that's been introducing controls introducing new elections acts and has been updating their rules, has in fact introduced third-party, some form of control on third-party spending. Now, we are not seeking a ban on organizations communicating with their own membership during an election. For example, during this past federal election, I was forwarded an email from a constituent who belongs to a labor union. And she was very concerned that this had come to her, and I explained to her that that's perfectly legitimate. This labor union is allowed to communicate with its members. It's perfectly fine. Any organization can communicate, send an email out and say, we're supporting X or Y, or we think you should do this or that. So it said, Sister Brother, I am contacting you on behalf of the Labor Outreach Campaign in regards to the upcoming federal election. The Labor Outreach Campaign is coordinated by the Canadian Labour Congress in conjunction with the partisan unions within the labour movement. We are working to mobilize our members to vote as well as support candidates who stand for workers' issues. And I note the term partisan unions there, which I thought was interesting. CUPE National, as you are aware, is a partisan union and strongly supports the NDP. We are asking members to check out our elections campaign from the CUPE website, and it lists the website. And to please contact me if you would like a sign on your lawn and would like to volunteer an hour or two for the candidate in your riding. Also tomorrow, April 16th, 2011, please join your fellow trade unionist in a Worker Appreciation Day at Robert Chisholm's campaign office, 124 Woodlawn Road, Dartmouth, for a day of food, fun, and festivities. And it goes on to indicate the times. I look forward to hearing from you over the next week or two in solidarity. And it's the member area coordinator from the CUPE Labour Outreach Campaign. So we are not advocating that this kind of thing stop, although, geez, we'd like it if they were supporting us. But in this is not what we're talking about. We're talking about advertising. We're talking about sending out flyers that appear to be flyers for one party when in fact they're not for a party. They're in fact being put out by an organization. And I guess I find it very disturbing that the government brought forward this bill without thinking about third-party advertising, because to me, it's a pretty basic issue. And maybe that's just because of my particular experience with it, but I don't think so. And so we would welcome to see, we'd welcome an amendment, something along the line of what we see in the federal government, where there are sort of a global amount that you can't spend over, and then amounts within that amounts per riding, so that for example, if the global amount is $25,000 for the entire province, then they would not be able to spend more than, say, $3,000 per riding. Some other highlights of the new Elections Act, if I could just go through the Act and take a look, is improved access for voters and enhanced voting options. So improving the convenience and increasing opportunities to vote during the election period, new continuous poll and extended advance polls. What we really have seen over the last number of years in terms federally is that this is very convenient for people to do. People travel, people go away on business, people are having surgery, that kind of thing. So knowing that people I had some friends who are not well and who are waiting to see surgeons, and they were hoping that they might get in during the writ period, and so they went off and voted early because they didn't know what each new day would bring, and I think it makes it much easier to fulfill their obligation to vote if they can go, and they know they can go vote at Elections Nova Scotia office or at in the case of the federal election, the Elections Canada office. And I know federally, people who are, say, in nursing homes or who are bedridden, having an official from Elections Canada visit and take their ballot at that time has meant, you know, we had one friend who had Lou Gehrig's disease, and she was very determined to vote. And Elections Canada officials came and visited her, and she got to vote, and she called us at the campaign office. This was, I guess, about 10 years ago, and she was so excited she had been able to vote, and it meant an awful lot to her. And I think that so often people who are ill or who have various disabilities might find it difficult to get out of the house to vote, and for them that is very important for them to be able to participate as a citizen. I know it made our friend Joy's day that day. The second highlight on the new Elections Act is the independence and accountability of the Office of the Chief Electoral Officer. And it makes the CEO an officer of the legislature, and this officer is appointed in the same manner as the Auditor General, with the same high level of independence. And it makes provision for the appointment of returning officers through merit-based selection processes, and those would now be appointed by the CEO and not the governor in council. And it also makes provision for the improved training and professional development of election officers. I can tell you that one of the things that I heard a lot on election day was the issue of identification. And for some reason, various election officers didn't know what the rules were, and they were turning people away who didn't have a driver's license. Because a passport isn't good enough, because on your passport you write in your address. So the passport's not going to work. And those people should not have been turned away. There are a number of different options that they can take to prove their address. And when I hear about people getting turned away from polls, I have to say that really ticks me off. Because quite frankly, if people have made the effort to vote, I do think that our elections officials should be well enough trained to know what the rules are. And that was not happening in this past federal election. And it wasn't, from what I was hearing, it was happening over a wide area. And if we are going to improve the training and professional development of elections officers, I think we should also be giving them a literacy test, because if they can't read instructions, they may not be getting the instructions right. And when we hire census workers, they get a literacy test. So I think we should be doing that with our elections officers, so that we know they can actually read the instructions. I do believe actually that the voting cards indicate that you must be able to prove who you are. So perhaps, and that was on the federal cards, so perhaps with the provincial cards, we could give a little more information about how you do that. They do, I think, refer you to a website which gives you indication, but if you don't have access to a computer, that might be difficult. So perhaps it would be a good idea if that information were printed directly on the card. And maybe the card would have to be a little bit bigger so that would all fit on there, because there's a number of different, if you don't have this, then this, sort of a number of different contingencies, I guess. So that might make things a little more difficult. But I do think it's important that people know that no longer is your card just good enough to walk in with. And for people who I have an aunt who is legally blind, so she's never had a driver's license. So for her, proving her identity can be a little more challenging. I talked to a constituent on Saturday night whose father is in his 90s, and he's not driving anymore, and so he doesn't have a driver's license. So it was a little challenging for him to prove his identity, but his wife was there and she drives, so she was able to swear as to his identity. And I do think that making that clear, the process clear beforehand, is a good thing. I do think that if we are encouraging people to go out and vote, if we are concerned about voter turnout, then it is incumbent upon us to actually make it a little easier for people to A, get there, and B, when they get there, make it easier for them to vote, not throw up other roadblocks in front of them. I also think that, oh, and now I've lost my train of thought, but I'm sure it'll come back again. One of the things that under the independence and accountability of the Office of the Chief Electoral Officer, it indicates that a code of conduct for election officers should be followed. And I find it kind of funny that here we are talking about a code of conduct for elections officers, and yet we as MLAs, my party tried to introduce such a thing, and it has not been called, and we would like to see that. I know. Modernization and simplification is the third subheading there, and there's a simplified procedure for the conduct of recounts. And as we saw in this federal election, there are a number of recounts underway because there were some very close races. And this bill does not deal with CBC and calling certain candidates elected or not elected early, and there's been some mea culpas on that part already, so I'm sure we don't need to discuss that further. But in terms of the conduct of recounts, you know, it's important to have rules around this sort of thing. I think we probably all remember, well, maybe not the member for Yarmouth because he was probably at diapers then, but I think we all probably remember he's really young. Remember the election that occurred, I think was it in Shelburne, where there was, it was flip a coin, right? Or draw it out of a hat, you know, boy, if people, you know, whenever people say, oh, you know, my vote's not going to make a difference, I always like to tell them the story of Shelburne, where there was a tie, and then they had to break the tie. So I think having rules around what happens in that kind of a case, or what happens around a recount, is very important. The modernization and simplification subheading also modernizes much of the language in the Act, and goodness knows that's always nice when we can actually look at a document and read it and figure out what it actually means. And it also includes a provision to incorporate best practices in geographic information services, list management, and other relevant technology. And I have to say, I still have not decided whether the permanent list is part of the reason why we have seen voter engagement plummet, because I note that the list seemed, the permanent list, when that came in, that also seemed to come to be at the same time that we saw voter engagement plummet. And I'm wondering if that list simply isn't that accurate, and that's why we are not seeing, it looks like we are not seeing a lot of people voting when maybe they've moved or passed on or whatever. But I wonder whether the permanent voters list is the way to do things. And or maybe it's just the simple act of having someone knock on your door and say, I'm enumerating for the election, that maybe makes people who don't follow politics or follow elections more cognizant of the fact that, in fact, an election is underway. Although I really don't know how you could have missed the federal one, because it seemed to be everywhere. But then again, I might be a little biased that way. The fourth highlight of the new Elections Act is improved accountability, enhanced provisions for the protection of personal information and for security of the list of electors. And I think we can all agree that that is an important aspect of the list. And the consolidation of election finance legislation in the Elections Act, because currently elections finance provisions are scattered in the Elections Act, the Members and Public Employees Disclosure Act, and the Income Tax Act. And anybody who's ever been an official agent, I haven't been an official agent, I have been a campaign manager, but it's complicated. It's a complicated enough job without having to find the various parts of the legislation that are pertinent to you in several different places. So I think any time that we can see some streamlining of such things is very important. The fifth highlight of the new Elections Act is education and communications. And the first thing is a program to involve Nova Scotians aged 16 to 18 as election workers. And, you know, I think that's a really laudatory thing, a program to get young people interested in elections. My sense is that a lot of young people, probably more than we realize, are actually interested in elections, and they often have lots to say. Anybody who's gone to a high school during an election period, you often get a lot of students who have very good questions, who are very engaged, but I can't help but think that if we actually taught them a civics class along the way, that, gosh, they might be a lot more engaged. They might, understand what the heck is going on, the difference between the three levels of government. I think we do our students a disservice when we do not give them the tools that they need to be informed citizens. And I'm gravely concerned about that lack in what I believe is a lack in our education system. I think if we're giving them tools to do all kinds of other things, to be functioning adults, this is one thing that we should be teaching our students, how governments work. Tuesday night, I actually am looking forward to going to the First Bedford Scouts, and I'll be speaking to them about what we do here and what we don't do here, and what we do in a constituency office on any given day. And I have those excellent books, the Democracy 250 books, along to give to the Scouts. And thank you, former Mr. Speaker. Those were great. And so I'm looking forward to speaking to these young men and women, because there are girls in the troop as well, about what we do here. And that when I go to speak to them, that's just one part of their civics badge that they'll be working on. But I do find that kids who have parents who are engaged, and it doesn't even have to be that they work on an election campaign or anything. My parents certainly, when I was growing up, would never have dreamed of volunteering on an election campaign, but they always had a sign. Of course, it depended which party got to the House first, which sign went up, because my mom voted one way and my dad voted another way. But and no, now they don't vote NDP. And but they would never, we always talked politics at the dinner table, always, always, always. But they would never have dreamed of volunteering on a campaign. But the result was that as we were growing up, my brothers and I had a keen interest in politics, although growing up, I would never have imagined I'd be standing here today, I have to say. I thought if I was really lucky, maybe I could go work for an MP or an MLA someday, but I certainly never imagined I'd be doing this. But I think that, in fact, one of my earliest memories is of being in the backseat of the car, and my dad was listening to the radio, and he was very irritated at Mr. Trudeau, let's just put it that way. So I like to remind him of that when he's out here working on a Liberal election campaign. So anyway, I do think that, you know, families that discuss politics will probably breed children who vote, but maybe not necessarily, but I do think that we would certainly give our students the tools to make decisions about voting if we actually had civics courses in high school. And you know, it wouldn't have to be a huge, you don't have to, you know how to draft a bill or anything at the end of it, but I do think some basic tools around how government works would be a really huge advantage for the young people of Nova Scotia, and maybe we would actually see voter turnout increase. It's funny, on Friday night, my family was at bingo night at Bedford Junior High, and some girls came up and they wanted my husband, as the newly re-elected MP, to sign their bingo cards and get a photo and everything like that. And I said, oh no, now there'll be no living with them. But it was one of those rare moments where you had the sense that politics had actually petered through the firmament that is Facebook and Twitter and whatever else the kids are on, and they knew what was going on, and they had actually had, in the grade 7 class at least, they had actually had a mock election. And actually, I believe the Minister of Finance indicated to me that his 8-year-old son had voted in a mock election during this time too. And I'll let him tell you how his son voted. I won't. He told me, but anyway. But I think those experiences for kids, if they're in a class with an engaged teacher, that can make a difference along the way because they get an idea of how things work. Majority and minority parliaments, that's, you know, for 8-year-olds, that might be a bit much, but it's, I think that can be a help. So I really would like to see some provision made to increase the education of students along the way so that they actually have the tools that they need to become engaged citizens. Education and communications also includes training programs and guidelines for volunteers such as official agents, electoral district associations, etc., involved in election campaigns to improve understanding and compliance with election rules and regulations. They're pretty complicated rules. Federally, I think provincially they're not quite as onerous, but the reporting aspects for federal campaigns are quite onerous, and I think that education really is key for the volunteers who are doing that, because you definitely want to make sure that your people who are working are not breaking any rules, that they are in fact dotting the I's and crossing the T's and making sure that they are doing everything possible to make sure that they are obeying the rules. I don't think that official agents or campaign managers want to do anything that could jeopardize their candidates' chances of a victory or embarrass their candidate or anything like that. That particular provision, the Education and Communications, also includes the authority to develop and implement public communication, education, and information programs, and to appoint advisory panels, conduct research and studies to improve understanding of the election process and democratic traditions and values. And I always thought that politics and government was the most fascinating thing that I could imagine, and it was a hobby before it was an avocation before it became a vocation, and I think a lot of people think it's kind of boring, but I can't imagine anything that's more important than, you know, if I'm speaking to a class, I'll say, how did you get here today? And the kids will say, well, we came on a school bus. Well, you know, the roads that you're driving on, that's the result of government. The bus, the regulations surrounding how that's looked after. There's regulations surrounding that. The street lights, everything you did today, whether it was putting on makeup or whether it was what you ate for breakfast, that is regulated in some way, shape, or form by government. So don't let anybody tell you that what we do here isn't important. And I think it's important for kids to know that if that what we do is to make life better. A number of years ago, my husband, I think it was maybe 95 or 96, my husband was an election observer in Haiti. And I guess it would have been after 96 because I had a new little baby at home. And so Jeff was going off to, and for Hansard, that's GEOFF. Jeff was going off to Haiti to be an election, yes, to be an election observer. And I was very uptight. And somebody said to me, well, you know, he's just going off to observe an election. And I said, well, you know, first of all, there's been violence there for election observers, so there have been threats made. And second of all, my biggest concern, bigger than that, because I figured that would be kind of fluky, but my biggest concern was, in fact, that this was a country that didn't have a lot of rules around things that we take for granted. I was worried that a bridge he was driving over would crumble or something like that. So you can imagine my my chagrin when I think it was about 7 days I didn't hear from my husband, who normally calls me every night. And all I knew was that he had gone into the Central Plateau area called Anche, and then I heard nothing. And so finally one night he called me and he explained, you know, if he wanted to call me, he had to walk to the local telco, and if they had power, and if all of these different things, then he might be able to get through to me. As it turned out, he happened to be one of the areas where they had death threats against the election workers, which really did not improve my anxiety level. And once he got home, he made it through it fine. But once he got home, he was describing to me what the roads were like in Haiti. And he said it was like a moonscape. You just bounced up and down the whole way along. And he said at one point, yes, yeah, well, it's kind of like the roads in Cape Breton West, according to my colleague from yes, from Cape Breton West. But he said that at one point they were about to go down a very windy mountain, and they were going along the outside, and this young boy waved them over, and they got out and they looked at, I think it was the back left tire. So this would have been it was the front left tire. It was the outside, and all of the lug nuts, save one, had been sheared off from the sheer bouncing up and down of this Jeep. And they would have died of starvation before they hit the ground from this mountain. So that was the kind of thing I was worried about when he went off to Haiti. And it's the kind of thing that we so often here in Canada and in Nova Scotia take for granted, that the services we get from government will be provided and that the regulations will be followed. Because in Haiti, if there were regulations, and I'm not sure there were, they weren't being followed because they had other more pressing issues, shall we say. Another area that another highlight of the new Elections Act, I should say, deals with offenses and contraventions. And this includes enhanced provisions for the Chief Electoral Officer to investigate and deal with offenses and contraventions, and refer appropriate matters to the Director of Public Prosecutions for appropriate action. And you know what? I'll bet you most of us go through our careers in Parliament or in the legislature, and you never have to deal with that. But yet again, I have an example here from, I believe it was the 2000 election, and one of the other parties in the federal election decided to drop a fake poll in the election, in the final weekend before the election. They dropped a piece of literature. They never used the actual word poll. It was a survey, and then numbers suggest and things like that. And it indicated that the Conservative candidate was in first place, the NDP candidate was in second, and the Liberal candidate was in third. And it was, although it had come out from the local PC campaign, there was no, the official imprimatur from the official agent of that. And it actually gave the name of a friend of mine as the media contact on that, which was interesting because she wasn't actually working on that campaign. And that ended up going to Elections Canada. It ended up that the local PC Association ended up being investigated for dropping information that was A, not correct, and B, did not have the official agent's sign off on it, and they could have been fined $10,000. In the end, the local candidate, a Liberal candidate that I was working for, declined to have that happen because he didn't want to bankrupt the local PC Association. But so these kinds of things do happen. There are shenanigans, and certainly in this past federal election and during the past provincial election, I heard of cases both in Dartmouth where people who had Liberal signs were being called and were being told that their polling station had changed. And that takes a fair amount of organization to be able to actually pull that off, because you have to have people go out, look who has signs, go back, see who lives there, get their phone number, and then call them and misdirect them. So that kind of thing, I think, when it happens, needs to be dealt with. And you know, I did raise the issue when we had our briefing from justice officials about this, because I do think that if campaigns are going to engage in that kind of misdirection, then the CEO, the Chief Electoral Officer, needs to have the ability to actually investigate that kind of thing, and I guess that would include phone records, because I do think that this is an extremely unfortunate side effect, I guess, of competition, because elections are important, but I really just don't think that they're so important that you need to cheat to win. So I would hope that for cases like that we would see offenses and contraventions dealt with severely. And the seventh item that was listed as a highlight of the new Elections Act for me is needing major studies and piloting, enabling continuous improvement of election procedures through major studies of election-related issues and piloting provisions, i.e. the trial of e-voting when practicable securely with authorization of the House of Assembly. And I don't want to seem like a Luddite, but I'm not a big fan of e-voting simply because I don't believe that you can actually guarantee that the privacy of a vote when you're doing e-voting. I guess I have fewer concerns about it when we're actually talking about municipal voting because we don't have a party system there. And I don't think that at this point, municipal elections seem to have the number of volunteers who could actually stand over top of people or whatever as they vote. But I do think that it's very important to make sure we have the sanctity of privacy, the sanctity of the vote, that it's a secret ballot. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. The sanctity of the secret ballot, I think, is very important. So, to conclude, I have a number of minor concerns, which I've outlined here. For me, the biggest concern is around the issue of third-party controls over third-party spending during an election period. I think that the ability of third parties to influence the outcome of a vote is, at this point, with nothing controlling it, gives third parties an advantage over political candidates, an advantage over political parties which have controls on how much they can spend. So at this point, if you have a third party which has unlimited ability to spend versus a political party or a candidate who has a cap on how much they can spend, it doesn't seem fair to me, and it doesn't seem right. And I would think that and I'm glad to hear that the government has now come to that conclusion. I would like to point out that this issue was raised when the government did come and do a briefing with our caucus last, I believe it was Thursday, Wednesday or Thursday. That issue was raised loud and clear as the key issue for us. It was also raised by our communications staff with the government's communications staff. So we were very clear, even before Friday when this bill was introduced, that what we needed to see was some controls, some meaningful controls on third-party spending. And so, what we would like to see is something close to what we have, in fact, seen with the federal government, where there is an overall control that the group can spend sort of globally across the province, and then also within each electoral district that there would be some controls on there, because otherwise, quite frankly, it's simply not fair, and it is, and we will see the power of money, and I don't think that that's how elections should be decided. It should be on a contest of ideas, but it should not be about whether Group A or Group B has lined up another group with deep pockets. That does not seem right to me. I'm surprised that the Justice Minister hadn't read the report from the chief electoral officer before this weekend, as my colleague, the leader of the third party, indicated to me, it wasn't really far into the report that this was dealt with. So it could not have been that difficult. I believe it was about page 6. Page 6, okay, thank you. Page 6, he indicated to me. So it wasn't like it was, buried deep at the back end of the report. It was pretty close to the beginning. And I just think that this is significant enough an issue that it should, in fact, have our comments that came back to Justice on Thursday, the comments of our communication staff, should have raised a red flag for the government, because to say that we want to study this more, well, quite frankly, it's been studied to death across the country. I don't think any further study is needed. Meaningful controls are needed. And again, I want to make it clear, as I indicated, I had that letter come to my office from a member of CUPE, very concerned that this was not kosher. And I said, it's kosher, absolutely. Unions or any other group, whether it's a business group or a charity or a church group, they're entitled to talk to their, well, the church group might lose its charitable status, but any other group is allowed to talk to their members about what they would like to see. So we are not interested in limiting the communication that an organization like that would have with its members. But what we are interested in seeing is leveling the playing field so that a candidate will not be overwhelmed by the decision of an organization to massively overwhelm a single candidate over an issue. And because at this point there's no stricture, there's no controls on this group. If what they say is inaccurate, that may go unchallenged. The thing is, political parties have attention on them during election campaigns. And so for them to be able to, if Party A is saying something that's completely wrong about Party B, in theory, the media should be calling them on that. In theory, the other party should be calling them on that. And that doesn't happen as much. There's no penalty for a third party if they're saying outrageous things, because they're not actually in the election. If Party A is lying about Party B, apparently, it should affect Party A. But the problem is that there's nothing that's going to happen to a third party if they're out there making outrageous claims, and they may get what they want. So I think the government should be looking at meaningful controls. Not just controls, but meaningful controls. Controls that will make sure, and quite frankly, I think the federal government's model on this is bang on. Yes, the Supreme Court has ruled that you cannot say there is no third-party advertising, but there should be some controls on that. I realize I've not quite taken my full hour, but I think we're really close. I think we have about 9 minutes left, and I know I can tell the member for Antigonish is very upset that I may not fill the full 9 minutes. I can tell because he looks sad right now. But oh yeah, well maybe that's asleep. But at this time, I would like to thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to speak about what I view is a very important issue. And with that, I will take my seat.
Thank you. Before I recognize the honourable member, I would like to bring attention to the honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove on an issue of tabling emails that were unsigned by the author. On October the 16th, 2003, Speaker Murray Scott, but with respect to a letter, the Speaker observed that information that would reveal the author had been removed. He ruled that any document that is not tabled in its entirety is incomplete and therefore out of order. Unsigned or unattributed documents should not be put before the House. And also, Speaker McEwen, in November the 15th, 1993, a member wanted to read a letter and eliminate the identity of the person who wrote it. Speaker McEwen had interceded and stated that an anonymous letter is out of order, according to Beauchesne. He further stated that an unsigned letter should not be read in the House. And further to Scott's ruling also said, I would like to remind all members when attempting to read from emails or to table printed copies, these forms of communication first ensure that the name of the author is shown on the copy of the email and that the member is prepared to disclose the identity of the author and to take full responsibility of the context before it is tabled in the House. So I'm going to say this evening that I will ask my chief clerk to send a procedural note to all the caucuses, reminding them of this fact, and like he has done that before in the past and will continue to do that. So I will ask him to do that to remind all members that that is the procedure. The honourable member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was not aware of that ruling, or I would have paraphrased the communication or something like that. So please be rest assured that in the future I will fully comply.
Thank you, and that's why I'll have my chief clerk send out a procedural note, like he continues to do, to make sure that everybody is aware of their procedures and the policies in the floor of the legislature. The honourable leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my distinct pleasure to rise and speak on this bill tonight. I can't help but note that we are talking about one of the most fundamental and basic principles of our democratic system. That is the rules around which people are granted their franchise, the privilege of voting in an election, and the rules that we put in place to assure all Nova Scotians that when they take the time and effort to determine who they're going to cast their ballot for, how they're going to exercise their franchise, and when they go and do exactly that, Mr. Speaker, that they have rules in place that are fair and impartial and based on sound democratic principles. It's, of course, appropriate that those rules be updated and modernized from time to time to keep pace with the ever-changing nature of our society. I say that recognizing that we are, in fact, here in this chamber in Halifax at the very home of responsible government in our country and in our Commonwealth and around the world. Nova Scotia was a leader all those years ago, more than 250 years ago, in modernizing its system of government to ensure that it was democratic, that the people's voices were heard, that people chose their government in a fair and impartial way. And we've lived by those principles ever since. Even though that behind those principles, the rules of the game may change from time to time in order to keep pace with technology or with a modernizing society, with a society that communicates at a faster pace, with a society that has grown in wealth, and in a society where the distribution of wealth has changed dramatically. It's important and appropriate that our rules be updated from time to time to reflect that. But, Mr. Speaker, I am using the term responsible government particularly because I think it's fair to say that although the term responsible government has a very specific meaning in our parliamentary system, that Nova Scotians would apply other meanings to the word responsible government. The exact meaning, of course, in parliamentary tradition is that a responsible government is one that is responsible to its electors through the legislature. In other words, the Premier and his ministers, his or her ministers, are drawn from the legislature and are therefore responsible to the House of Assembly. That's what responsible government means. But I say this because when Nova Scotians talk about a responsible government, They mean that, but they also mean a government that does its homework, a government that doesn't put forward legislation until it has gone through the appropriate steps of consultation, of examination, of looking at best practices around the country and around the world and so on. And although this government may meet the first test in that the Premier and Cabinet are responsible to the legislature in the traditional sense, here again we have a bill where they are not responsible in the way that most Nova Scotians consider the word responsible. They haven't, yet again, done their homework. It's shocking, Mr. Speaker, because I'll contrast them to a group of electors who I believe did do their homework at a higher level than this government has done. And I'm referring to Mr. Kane's grade 5 class at my 11-year-old daughter's school, because they had an election project in line with the federal election that we just all went through. And they had to study all of the parties, and they had to determine which platforms, which candidates most closely respected their views, keeping in mind that they are 11 years old. And they did research, and they wrote papers, and they debated amongst themselves, and they came to their decision on May the 2nd, and they cast their ballots in secret, and then those ballots were counted in a fair and impartial manner by the teacher. What could be more fair or impartial than that? I don't think it's a coincidence that the Conservatives actually won that election in Mr. Kane's grade 5 class, because after all, look at all the research that they had done and the homework that they had done. It only seems appropriate that they'd come to such a logical conclusion for their country. But that is unfortunately a very sad contrast to the work that's gone into this bill. Because it was 2 years ago, Mr. Speaker, that this House passed a resolution empowering the Chief Electoral Office to go about an examination of all of the issues that would be involved in producing a modernized Elections Act for our province. And it has been a long time since this exercise has been done, and society has changed a lot since this was last done more than 25 years ago. We have Twitter, and we have Facebook, we have blogging and email, and we have the internet generally is now a tool of communication. In fact, in my house, my kids think that email is old-fashioned, and it wasn't even in use when the Election Act was last faced with a thorough revision. So society continues to evolve, and so too do the rules of democracy need to evolve to keep up with it. But, Mr. Speaker, as the rules evolve to keep track of a fast-paced, ever-changing society, the basic principles that underline those rules, they do not need to change. The basic principle that Nova Scotians should cast their vote in secret, that every Nova Scotian, regardless of their mobility, regardless of their income, regardless of their geography, should have easy and fair access to a polling station, that every Nova Scotian should be on the list of electors, that every Nova Scotian should be able to get to a polling station and all the way from the front door of that polling station through to the ballot box and back without restriction is a principle that is timeless, that has existed since Confederation itself and will continue to exist well into the future, regardless of what technology might come and go in the meantime. Or the idea that when the time comes